Hello, my name is Celeste Gardner, and I'm the Director of Academic Affairs for Global Minded. On behalf of our founder, Carol Carter, and the Global Minded team, I welcome you today. For those of you who don't know, Global Minded creates a capable, diverse talent pipeline for people of color, women, and first-generation college through connecting them to role models, mentors, internships, and jobs. We have annual events, inclusive leader awards, and a first-gen to college leadership program, which starts tomorrow virtually. This week is part of our Event 2020 coverage of access and equity. Next week is our main stage conference theme, The Future of Work is Diverse and Inclusive. I would like to introduce our panelists for today's presentation, Trauma Basics for COVID-19 Times and Beyond. Greg Darnieder is a National Postsecondary Strategy Institute partner who began his career in education as a middle school teacher in St. Louis. He worked for 15 years as the Executive Director of Youth Development and College Access Organizations in Chicago's Cabrini Green housing development. Beginning in 1993, he oversaw the Steens Family Foundation's community-focused philanthropic efforts in Chicago's North Lawndale community, including early childhood, education, organizational development, and affordable housing. In 2003, Greg established the Department of Postsecondary Education and Student Development at Chicago Public Schools, designing and implementing an assortment of post-secondary, academic, financial, and social support programs, and building university, corporate, and civic partnerships to enhance college access. He was also recognized as the Executive of the Year in the city of Chicago in 2008. In 2009, Secretary of Education Arne Duncan named Greg Senior Advisor to the Secretary on the College Access Initiative at the U.S. Department of Education, where he served as a leading voice on the President's 2020 goal. He also represented the Department of Ed on the First Lady's Reach Higher initiative. In 2016, he returned to Chicago, where he serves as Senior Advisor at the Steens Family Foundation to its comprehensive community investment strategies in the North Lawndale community. In addition, he established college and career strategic directions, providing consulting services across the country to school districts, foundations, and nonprofits focused on college and career strategies. His youth work for 15 years in the former Cabrini Green housing development has been captured in You Can't Be What You Can't See, The Extraordinary Power of Opportunity to Change Young Lives by Milbrey McLaughlin. We're delighted to have him with us today. Also with us is Dr. Plashan McCune, experienced educational administrator with a demonstrated history of working in the education management industry. Skilled in strategic planning, curriculum development, public speaking, staff development, and educational leadership. A leader in implementing restorative justice practices and mediation, trauma-informed training and coaching, individual and staff development. She's also the author of Trauma and Postsecondary Success, a framework for implementation, and is the founder and chair of the African American Young Ladies Summit program. Welcome today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Celeste. I really appreciate the opportunity, and it's actually an honor to be part of this conversation for the next hour. I've known Plashan and her family actually going back over 30 years. And so I'm really touched to be able to basically facilitate a conversation. So we encourage those of you listening in and participating in this to put your questions and comments in the appropriate box, and we'll be monitoring that and building them into the conversation as we go on. But Plashan, can you give us a little bit more insight into your experience and expertise before we jump into the meat of the conversation this afternoon?
Thank you. And thank you, Greg, for agreeing to do this. I love that you are a part of this, as you have been instrumental in our family's lives for years. So I appreciate that. And your work across the country has been amazing. Some of my professional experiences include being a juvenile detention officer, foster care, case manager. I actually worked in a residential treatment program for a while for boys in the Chicagoland area. I've worked in community-based organizations, led them, and been a mental health therapist, teacher, school counselor, assistant principal, district administrator, and now leading Higher Learning U. So those are some of the highlights.
Well, let me just throw in that you also have a doctorate in educational leadership, and that the topic that we're focused on today couldn't be more relevant in terms of what our country is going through, actually what the world is going through, not only with initially the COVID-19 challenge that we've been experiencing since early March, but also what's happened in the last 10 days on the racial divisiveness and issues around policing our communities and the such. But I actually want to back up a little bit further, give people a little bit more flavor of who you are, because I know that you grew up on the south side of Chicago, you went to a neighborhood high school, you have entered the world in ways that probably many of us listening to you don't really understand, and why you're so uniquely positioned to talk about this, because you've achieved incredible things over your life, and you just mentioned a number of them. I mentioned that you have a doctorate, and for, if you will, a girl from the south side of Chicago, that's not the typical journey that a young woman would take. So just give us a little bit more, and then we'll jump about yourself, and then we'll jump into the conversation.
Okay, yes, thank you, Greg. I'm glad you know me.
I know you a little bit.
Yeah.
A little bit better than most.
I grew up, yes, on the south side of Chicago, where some people would call Chirac, and that's Inglewood, Chicago, where there's lots of poverty, gangs, violence, a lot of disparity. And I went to the neighborhood school. My high school was Robeson High School, and it actually doesn't exist anymore. And one of the prerequisites, I was a cheerleader, one of the prerequisites for being on the cheerleader team, in addition to being able to cheer, which I can still do, by the way, was being able to fight. Because a lot of times we had to fight our way out of different communities after games, especially when the other team lost, right? And Robeson at that time was very good pretty much in every sport. And so, so growing up on the south side of Chicago was difficult. I also, to survive, got involved in gangs and weathered a lot of things. I had some great teachers, even though there was some, I attended a very challenging high school. I had teachers who believed in me and pushed me and had high expectations for me to achieve. And so I did. Yeah.
So I just want to acknowledge, before I ask you the first question, is, you've also written this book, which is on the screen for folks, Trauma and Postsecondary Success. And that's a very practical tool that also reflects a huge amount of what you probably to a large extent had to figure out yourself, but also had along the way a number of caring adults to be there at the appropriate, strategic times that kept you moving along. So my first question is real basic. What is trauma, and how does trauma impact particularly the brains of our young people?
So I wanted people to actually see it in addition to me reading it. So trauma is in some ways simple in the sense that it impacts the brain, and it's the different things that happen to us that impacts the brain. And so it's also complex in how it shows up and how different people will experience the same situation, but experience it differently, and it'll impact them differently. We typically think of trauma as something more severe, such as assault, molestation, natural disasters, similar to what we're going through now with the pandemic, but also what happened in Louisiana. The key is not in the actual event. It's in our reaction that allows us to cope with events after that. And it's a real or perceived threat to the life or bodily integrity, our own, or the life or bodily integrity of someone that we love. And one of the things I like to stress, because this is a SAMHSA definition, basically, is that it's not just the people that we love. It can be a stranger, like what's going on now. We don't know Mr. Floyd, right? A lot of us didn't know him, but we're all impacted, or a lot of us have been impacted by what happened to him. There are other situations, especially in the Black community, that we have experienced for hundreds of years. And some of them we have personally been impacted by, but others we've heard about it, and it's impacted us. But it causes an overwhelming sense of terror, horror, helplessness, and fear. And the point of it is that trauma has lasting adverse effects on our functioning, our mental health, our physical health, our social, emotional health, and our spiritual well-being.
So it's my understanding that brain development happens obviously rapidly once a child is born for the next couple years. But then an even more important time of brain development is in early adolescence. So can you talk a little bit about how trauma is happening to any individual, you know, at probably during these times of brain growth? What's the impact there? Are young people even more susceptible to being traumatized, you know, in their early adolescent years and early childhood years? Not that whenever it might happen, it happens, but I'm just curious whether we need to be particularly more sensitive to early adolescence, since we're not so much talking today about early childhood, not that we couldn't, but so can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the impact of trauma on the developing brain is very significant. And as you mentioned, also in early childhood, because when we experience trauma, we actually go back to our survival part of our brain. And that part gets stronger, while the part that is the executive functioning part, the part that allows us to access our academics, right, and to grow and learn, that's up here in the front. But our brain is back here. And so the stronger our survival brain is, the more we have to exist in that space, the weaker this part gets and the smaller this part gets. And so whether it's, especially if it's in early childhood that children are experiencing trauma, we have to work harder to fix that, to counteract those things. But also young people, they're at a very special time of their development, right? In all those areas, social, emotional, learning, relationships, and their brains are significantly impacted by trauma, the development of their brains. Just like if children introduce drugs into their body and it impacts their brain development, it's the same for trauma. It impacts their ability to navigate their world around them, and definitely impacts their academics and their learning.
Yeah, so I was a middle grades teacher for a number of years, and I actually enjoyed the silliness and craziness of, you know, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th graders. But we also see on TV, and there are even TV shows that seem to highlight that, you know, young people jumping off the roofs of their homes onto a trampoline because
risky behavior.
Somehow it seems like a reasonable thing to do, even though at our age it's like total insanity and such. So you have that going on in a lot of and probably all of us, I went through it, you went through it. But we got to the other side without too much destructive physical, and other behaviors. So that's happening regardless, I assume, and I'm certainly no expert in this, but when you load on trauma into those age frames, the intensity of the impact, I would assume, increases tremendously. And students, and then there are certain children, because of their living environments, could be just the neighborhood they live in, it could be the household they live in, could be, parents or guardians dealing with alcoholism and drugs, or lack of employment, and their own emotional challenges as parents. Talk about why then some children are so much more vulnerable, and we have to pay special attention to them because of the trauma that they're experiencing. And if we're not sensitive to it, the long-term impact of what that can be on their lives.
Yeah. So some children, especially children born with medical challenges, like your granddaughter, some children, especially our African American and Latino children, that come into this world in the state of institutional racism, are more vulnerable. One, because children in general have just fewer resources because they're children. They don't have rights. They're dependent on adults for everything. They don't know how to navigate the world. So they're a lot more vulnerable, and they don't have a voice. And so being in that space of not having voice, not having rights, being dependent on adults, and then those adults also, especially in the case of our African American and Latino young people, even the adults in their lives don't have rights and voice and aren't safe in a lot of spaces. I want to share this story, actually a couple of them. I was doing a training for some district administrators here in Denver a couple years ago around this work. And one of the men involved in the training said, well, am I traumatizing my grandson? And of course I had to ask questions, especially as a mandated reporter. I had to ask, right? What do you mean by that? Tell me more. David, just in case you're listening, I'm sharing your story, yes. And he said, well, when I take my grandson to the store, I have to tell him not to touch things. I have to tell him, to behave, not to run around, stay right by me, right? Different things like that. And I tell him, because if you don't, they can put you in jail, or they can hurt you, or maybe even kill you. And I was like, wow. And I asked him how was his grandson. He was 3. So he asked me again, am I traumatizing my grandson? And I asked him, are you? Or are you preparing him for the world that a young Black boy has to live in? And I mean, in these days and times, we're not even talking about Black boys. We're talking about Black men as well. So David, as the grandfather, also had to be careful, because being Black is a crime in some spaces. Just being in a store, being in your kitchen, cooking, walking down the street. And so all these factors impact the brain development of our children. So even me, I have a bachelor's, master's, doctorates, certifications, licenses, national board this, national board that. And I was showering at my neighborhood, literally 2 blocks down the street, at my neighborhood rec center, and was assaulted, verbally assaulted in the shower, in a private shower, by a Russian-speaking white woman at my rec center. And I'm naked in the shower. And she felt like it was okay to assault me. And the facility did nothing about it. Trails Rec Center, right down the street from my house. Right, I have voice, I have agency, I have doctorate degrees. Another friend of mine, her mom, who is a Latino woman, master's degree, educator, was shopping at the grocery store, putting her groceries in her car, and this white security officer literally physically drags her back in the store and to tell her that she stole something. And she shows the receipt that she paid for everything. They rip her groceries out of her hand, throw them on the ground, just went through a horrible situation in front of her daughter. And they stopped harassing her once her white husband showed up. Wow. And they apologized to her white husband, but never to her. So yes, our young people are vulnerable, but so are our adult people of color.
Right. Celeste, I want to just pause for a second and just see if there's any comments or questions that have been raised. And then I also want to invite those of you listening in, if you have a story to share with us to illustrate what we've been talking about. But I do want to switch the conversation here in a second in terms of what can communities do, what can schools do, what can families do, and put the, a proactive spin on the conversation. But are there any questions for Plashan or comments people are making or want to weigh in with?
Not right now, but we really appreciate you raising that point for everyone to put it in Q&A. And since you just spoke, one popped up. Okay. I guess we have a comment. Thank you so much for sharing such personal and emotional stories with us today. Thank you for speaking up. So we welcome anyone's comments or questions in the Q&A, and we will pass them on to Plashan or Greg.
Thanks, Celeste. We'll come back in a few minutes. But let me ask a question out of, kind of along the vein of, Plashan, what in the heck do we do? What can our communities do? You've worked with school districts in terms of creating safe schools for our young people that more directly address issues around trauma. How do we create trauma-sensitive schools and such? Can you offer some comments along those lines? And we'll just broaden the conversation here.
Okay. Thank you, Greg, for that. And thanks for the questions. Yeah, please keep them coming because I definitely want us to get to those. But what I want to start by saying is that what we see matters. How we see the children and the adults that we work with, it matters. So I want to share how sometimes people impacted by trauma show up, right? So this fight, flight, freeze, and if you see below, appease is added under freeze. So these are a lot of ways people see our children acting out in schools, but as an employer and as a supervisor, I've also seen adults show up in this way. So just because a person is older doesn't mean that they have not been impacted by trauma and have figured out how to navigate that. But most people have seen fight, flight, freeze, but a lot of people haven't seen the appease part. And so I want to hit that for a second. The appease part of a person who has been impacted by trauma, they might show up as willing to do anything to gain and keep your approval or attention, even if it hurts them. So a lot of times we will have our young people who do sexting, and and other inappropriate sexual acting out, those kind of things, because of this part of how they're reacting to their own traumas. So I wanted to make sure that people understand that what they see is a child crying out for help and needing help, and not punishment, but help, healing relationships, people who actually understand how to heal children. So the reason why I had it's important, this I here, is because Bernard, my husband, and my family, when we lived in California, we went to breakfast one time in our neighborhood. It was great. We were able to walk to these amazing spots. But anyway, we're having breakfast, and I overhear a father talking to his son. His daughter was there as well. And he was addressing his misbehavior in school. And he ended by saying, son, you have to, do better. But these things that you are doing, they are going to help you be a great leader. But we got to get you through high school. So he was talking back to his teacher. He wasn't finishing his work. He was being rude to classmates and disruptive in class. But because he was white, his father said, these things will help you be a great leader someday. But, right? And so it's about how you see the behaviors and how you respond. Now, a Black family would have had a very different conversation with that child. One, because that child would have been suspended or expelled or given a detention. This child's parents was just given a call or a warning, right? So very different. So what the adults need to do, I believe, Greg, was your question, how do we, can you rephrase ask your question again so I can make sure I answer it? I want to make sure to hit on that.
Well, it is like, how do we create these trauma-sensitive schools? How do we get both leadership, substitute the father with a school principal,
Okay.
or the teacher in the classroom? It would seem that there's a lot a single teacher could do, an adult in a youth setting. When you were talking, I was envisioning my days in the classroom or at a school, the student who at recess time separates himself or herself from the group and stands by the fence by themselves and, kind of stands out, which could be just, maybe they're just a shy kid. Maybe they just, they're new to the school, don't know anybody. But my mind goes to, well, that might be a kid who, has experienced or is experiencing some inappropriate behavior at the family level, and the neighborhood level, or whatever. Or the kid in the classroom who always sits in back and doesn't cause any trouble, sort of thing. We might think that child would be at the top of the list, and maybe they should be at the top of the list in terms of a teacher or an adult doing some sort of intervention. But what I heard you saying was there's all sorts of other behaviors. It could be the child who, immediately comes up to the teacher's desk anytime they have a chance because they want affirmation. They want somebody older to pay attention to them, to care about them, and so they don't retreat. They overly compensate by just not realizing they need a hug. They need, which is even, I guess, in many schools, not viable anymore. It certainly was when I taught, but I
right.
taught.
I break that rule all the time, except for in COVID.
Well, good. But that was 50 years ago.
Right.
You could do a lot of things 50 years ago that you wouldn't even possibly conceive of today. So anyways, I just wanted to have you say a little bit more that on these behaviors that we have to be careful about making assumptions that it's only this type of child, because this can play out from the individual child standpoint in a whole multitude of ways. At least I'm assuming that that would be your answer, but talk about that in terms of how do we find those children?
Well, I think, so let me go back. Ooh, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. So let me go back. So I think I would start by saying every single person that has a child in their life should be trained. And with at least a basic understanding of what trauma is, what it looks like, and how as adults we need to be prepared to address it. And when I say address it, we say address it a lot of times in school, and we mean it harshly as a repercussion or a punishment. And when I say address it, I mean, how do we respond when we know and understand what a child needs, which is what we're talking about, that we have the information, the knowledge, the practice to support them, to respond to them so that they can start healing, so that we can create healing spaces instead of spaces that re-traumatize children. So what I want to start with is we often talk about being trauma informed, but what I want to also introduce today is trauma sensitive. And I want to define trauma informed because a lot of times people talk about, oh, we're trauma informed, or we want to be a trauma informed district or a trauma informed organization, but they actually don't know what it means. So I want to go through and define this and then unpack the different things that we can do specifically as adults. So trauma informed is really impacts the service system. So it's the system. And so, yes, Greg, I heard you when you said what a teacher can do on their own and organizations and stuff like that. Yes, there are lots of things that individual teachers, after school programs, before programs, leaders and those kind of people can do, but it's more impactful when we create a system that is responsive and not just the individual. Because when it's a system, everywhere the child goes, they're getting the same information and feedback. When it's one teacher who's doing it, yes, it's still healing, but then they get healed and then the Band-Aid gets pulled off, right? So
right.
Puts the Band-Aid on, and then they go to the next teacher and they're not trauma informed, trauma sensitive, and that teacher does a bunch of stuff and pulls that Band-Aid right off. So now that cut is fresh, and then, the cycle continues. So
right.
Service system is influenced by having an understanding of trauma and the ways in which it is modified to be responsive. So a lot of times people go through trauma trainings and trauma discussions, trauma presentations, but the system is never modified to be responsive. People actually don't learn the skills and practices that they need so they actually can respond to what they see and what they're feeling, right? So if, like what you said, Greg, if that young person is over there by the gate, they can see them, but they don't know how to respond because they've never been trained to say, this child, although they might be in a peace space, right, or freeze space, might be over there, but they're really crying out for you to come and help them.
Right.
But you have to be trained to get that, to be responsive to the impact of traumatic stress, to decrease re-traumatization and contribute to recovery from traumatic stresses, in turn meeting the needs of all students. So this talks about the system needs to be doing something. It needs to be changed, modified, so that it can be responsive. But a lot of times when people are trauma informed, going through these trainings, they've never seen this definition and they don't know they have to do something different. The other is and hold on, let me move my little thing here, is trauma sensitive, which is where I focus more of my energy when I'm training and coaching and working with organizations. Trauma sensitive schools, organizations, because school is an organization, emphasize safety, empowerment, collaborative partnerships between children and adults. Within this model, the children's negative behaviors are seen as the direct or indirect result of an injury caused by physical, emotional, and social maltreatment. So trauma sensitive says we do something, and these are the specific things we do. We emphasize safety. The safety part is not just the physical safety of the drills and police, which aren't safe for people of color, especially Black people. So the more police we see, the less safe we feel, right? But emotionally safe, spiritually safe, right? For those people who have different religions, is it safe for them? For our LGBTQ community, is it safe for them? Is it empowering? Do they feel like they have a voice? Do they feel like if they say what they need, that they'll actually be empowered to address it, to even have a voice, and to partner with adults to make that happen? One of the things, and I want to throw a plug in here, some of my middle school girls in the African American Young Ladies program this year made me so proud. We started a process where we asked them, what would you do differently in your schools and community? What is it that you don't like and you would like for it to be different? And so we created a space for them to work in their school groups, to come up with things that they like to see changed. And it was amazing to see the things that they didn't like. And then the next session, we had them work on plans with adults at their tables on what they can do as young people to help make it different. And I offer myself up to the school groups to say, I'll be with you if you need me there to help translate for you, to give you a voice in your schools so that they will listen to you and be responsive to you. I was so impressed with how many of our young ladies from 6th grade were doing great work in their schools to say, this is what we need as Black girls in their schools. And I was impressed with the school leaders that actually listened to them and were responsive to them. So, and that's when we talk about being trauma informed and trauma sensitive, that's the work that adults have to do. Partner with our children to create a different world for them and ourselves, and know that when they show up with these negative behaviors, it's because they've been injured. It's not because they want to be bad or rude or disrespectful or whatever. It's because they're hurt and they need help. For you as the adult to regulate yourself instead of being reacting and like going back at them and saying, well, I'm going to punish you. And the more punishment I give you, the better you will be, which is, doesn't. And it hasn't worked, but we still keep doing it. And so we're in this insane cycle where we say, the more I talk to you and scream at you, the more I punish you, the better you'll be, but it doesn't work. And then we keep doing it. So
okay, I'm going to cut you off here.
Different.
I'm going to cut you off here. This is like more than fascinating.
Okay.
But, and I love, for the last 20 years when I've interacted with middle grade kids, I've asked them the same question that you asked your young ladies. And it's the most fascinating conversation when you're talking, and we're talking about 11, 12, 13-year-olds and their ideas for what should be changed and how they can be part of the change and so on and so on. But I'm seeing a number 9 up on my screen in terms of comments and questions.
Okay.
So Celeste, I'm going to turn this over to you and have you pull off.
Great. Sure thing. We do have a number of questions. One question is, how do we get more males of color to mentor in school settings? Black school-aged youth. Should I just read them all, or do you want to address them?
No, please one at a
Maybe.
time.
There you go.
Please one at a time. So I know, Greg, you've done some work with that, but one of the things that I would say is create spaces that welcome all people, and welcome their voice. Because a lot of times we ask people to volunteer, but we want them to do only what they want to do, what you want them to do. And when you bring people in, especially African-American people, whether it's women or men, they also should have a voice in what happens. But they need to feel welcomed, they need to feel respected, they need to feel valued. And you also need to create a relationship with them before you need help or mentoring, and not just when you need something from them. So be respectful in how you build relationships, and show up yourself as a person of integrity and wanting to partner and give and not just take from the Black community. And one of the things you need to understand is Black people, especially Black professionals, we're being pulled in so many different directions. Because a lot of us are first generation, our families, our brothers and sisters don't have college degrees, aren't necessarily professionals. So they also depend on us for a lot. And then we have our own children, and then we have all the things that we want to commit to. And a lot of times we get plugged as not wanting to be engaged or involved, but you don't understand the demands on our time. So we don't have time to always get up and go work out and have all this leisure time, because we're also trying to heal our communities and support our communities. So you need to start by being understanding of the already demands and stresses on us in general.
Great. Celeste, I'm going to throw this back to you for the next question or comment. I'm looking, we got about 15 minutes left.
Right.
And we still look like I have 9 or 10 people.
Right,
So.
right. We have a question about this webinar as it relates to COVID-19. This person understands why systemic racism is a constant trigger, but how is the pandemic connected?
Well, so the pandemic has created a space where, so first of all, people are healed in relationship, right? People who have been impacted by trauma are healed when they are in consistent, loving, patient, responsive relationships. The COVID has taken that away from a lot of people. It has created this isolation where young people, people in general, who went to work or went to school to have more healthy relationships and healing relationships, now they don't have that. That was taken away from them. In addition, our Asian students have now been targeted with hate crime because of the origin of COVID. So we've had children who have been spit on in grocery stores with their parents. We have had people hit, struck, call names, all those things. So in that sense, that community now has some original trauma just because of COVID, right? In the sense that the academic gap, the learning gap, that's going to widen now because of COVID, because now this is a missed opportunity for young people to get information that they would have gotten in school, they would have gotten interactions. We had young people who missed trips abroad because of COVID, so now they're missing that experience that would have helped them to be more well-rounded as a young person. There are so many things because our world has become unsafe just to breathe publicly, and interact, that is going to continue to cause more challenges. Young people who have, who look to school as a safe place, as a way to get away from their toxic home environments, some of them are going to or have committed suicide. Some of them who were cutting, but maybe stopped, are now going to be cutting, overeating. All these different ways that we handle our stress and our trauma are going to rise. Divorce because now you can't get away from that spouse that was driving you crazy. Now you're with them all the time. So we're going to see a lot of things that come out of this that are negative. However, I'm hoping that we also see some great things, that people realize how much they need and appreciate and respect each other. Also comes out as especially the need and respect for teachers, because they're not necessarily respected right now, and they're disrespected and mistreated a lot. And even parents have told teachers, you don't have to respect them. And hopefully now parents can see how much they need to partner with teachers.
Can I just add real quickly before we go to the next question that you know, having been a former administrator at Chicago Public Schools currently has 420,000 students, but it has a homeless rate of at least 13%, which means today over 55,000 students are either couch surfing or they're living in totally unstable environments, if not living in homeless shelters with their mothers and so on and so on and so on. So I think that 13% number is actually low, and I also think it represents a lot of particularly large school districts have similar percentages, and so the systems aspect of the challenge here of these unstable living environments for our kids are just when you think about them, they almost overwhelm me and the such. But let's go to the next question, Celeste.
Okay, great. This is a question from she says she's a white woman who has taught in high school and am now in higher ed, teaching in higher ed. She's curious, how can we be aware of students who may be experiencing or have experienced past trauma without making assumptions? Are there measurable indicators or recommended steps to take to avoid assumptions and stereotypes?
So yes, there are. First of all, I would say, again, everyone needs to be trained, but let's make the assumption that if a child shows up with the behaviors that I shared earlier, let's just assume that they have been impacted by trauma in some way. And then let's react or respond in ways that help to heal them, right? So if you are with a pregnant woman and they're in labor, you don't see their pain, but you assume that it hurts, right? You can only see that they're in pain when they're hooked up to the machine, right? And you show the things. But for children, just assume that they're in pain and respond. If you were with a pregnant woman trying to comfort her, you're not going to curse back at her when she curses at you. You're not going to break her fingers when she breaks yours. You're going to understand that she's hurting and that she needs to be comforted. And you're going to respond in kind, or you will be kicked out of the labor and delivery room. But when there are children, let's just assume that they were hurt. Learn how to help be a part of the solution of healing them. That's just assume that they're hurt. It's okay to assume that. To assume that they're hurting and that they need you to help heal them. And not assume, because I taught a course, facilitated a book study about the boy who was raised as a dog. And one of the teachers said, well, I think this child has had enough attention and they're just wanting attention all the time. And so how do you deal with that? And I said, we literally had finished the whole book study to help understand this. I said, why can't you assume that this child is trying to communicate that he needs something or she needs something else? Or maybe she needs more attention because she just needs it, because she needs it to develop this part of her brain and to come out of this part. So it's okay to assume that children are hurting and learn how to respond to that hurt.
Can I just add, this is a fascinating area for me that the caller mentions around higher ed, because I think the recent data over the last number of years has shown that mental health issues I know we're talking, that would be talking about people that are older than the group we're talking about today, have doubled and tripled and quadrupled sort of things. Suicide rates are up on college campuses and the such. And so I do think, you know, there's a conversation for those of you involved in higher ed that needs to be had, probably with multiple departments and from the administration to the, you know, the religious, whatever it's called, the ministers on campus and social student support services and the such. But I think the caller brings in up a topic that's just as relevant and maybe worth a separate call at some point. All right, let's go back and pick up another question, Celeste.
Okay, what type of training do you suggest community advocacy organizations complete? Is there training that one can complete at the community healthcare worker level? How would you suggest community-based organizations incorporate the ACEs questionnaire?
So I'm actually working with some community-based organizations now and have led them, so I understand that question. But I think the training shouldn't be that different for community-based organizations. And make sure I'm answering the question, Celeste, but go to a trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive training where you actually learn practices that you can literally practice today is what's important, and not just going, and this really angers me, so excuse my bias, I'll just make it obvious. I hate when people go through these trainings being trauma informed and they come out with no practices. They're just told self-care, take a walk, eat, sleep, and breathe. But they're not given specific things that they can do that helps them to heal themselves, because when you're around children who've been impacted by trauma, you're going to get hurt too. But if you don't already have your own trauma that you're coming into that relationship with, but also the skills and practices you need to help create the healing spaces, they're not very different because I train educators, organizations, professional individuals. They're similar skills, but if you look at my book, and it's available on Amazon, it actually breaks down what different people need to know, from students and parents, community members, different people on different levels in the educational space, what they need to know to help create these healing environments for children. So I hope that answered the question.
I'll just give a plug for the book and encourage people to buy Plashan's book and dive into this or reach out to her afterwards. All right, looks like the questions keep coming in, and we have about 7 minutes left. So for either really quick answers or
I hope I can.
Or 2 or 3. So fair warning. All right, Celeste, go for it.
Well, I just want to remind everyone, if they haven't seen it, both panelists, Plashan and Greg's contact information is in the chat. So if you'd like to get in touch with Dr. McCune or Greg, you can do so by looking at their contact information in the chat. We've had a few people ask if they can get a copy of this PowerPoint presentation. Is that something you could provide, Plashan, or?
Maybe. I'll see, because some of the stuff is proprietary, so it's in my book. So we'll see. I might submit something similar that you all can resource.
Okay. We have a question. Which organizations at a local level in Denver and national or international levels do you feel are doing a great job being trauma informed or sensitive and are setting excellent examples of creating the safe healing spaces, the skills and practices you've mentioned?
So unfortunately, I can't give you a lot of organizations that actually have been doing this. I'm actually starting a book called Teachers That Heal, where I'll be focusing on teachers and people in educational settings and organizational settings that are examples of this. But I haven't seen any organizations that are really doing this well. But I do want to say that I am working with CHIC, which is the Collaborative Healing Initiative within communities. And they're going to take their whole organization through training because they want to be ready for when our children come back. They want to be ready as a team to support each other. They work in schools where the children are highly impacted by trauma. And so they want to be ready. And so they're being trained like now so that they can be excellent. So I would say I would lift them up as an organization that is doing it and trying to make a difference. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, but then going back to the role models in the school, this person says that my district has infused equity across the pillars of our 5-year strategic plan. I'm heavily involved in my district's equity work. The staff does not match the demographics of the racially diverse students. I'm the only Black staff member in the middle school. I'm asked by non-Black staff, especially right now, what can we do?
Okay, so she's asking me what can she do? Is that
well, I think it speaks to the need for more diversity everywhere.
right?
But maybe give some good tips on how to respond to that when, this is a time where a lot of people are probably looking to that person for guidance, I guess.
Yeah, so I would say if you want some specific information on, first of all, if you want some mentoring as being the only Black person in a space, we can talk. So feel free to email me and we can have that conversation and you can get that support because that already is a very stressful space to navigate. As far if the question is about your organization needing some support or some help, I am doing some of that work and I also can help do some research to link you depending on where you are. With some organizations that are trying and moving forward. I know there's some organizations in Oakland that's doing some work. I was an administrator there in Oakland. But yeah, so if you want to email me, I can try to help you find some specific things. I just don't like recommending spaces where I know that they're trying to do some things, but there's some big gaps in the systemic part of their work. So
Okay.
that's the question.
Okay. All right, Celeste, I think we can do one more question and then I'll leave it in your hands.
Okay, how can we apply trauma-sensitive learning to higher education, especially community colleges where students of color are more likely to enroll? And what about rural communities, particularly for Native American or Indigenous groups?
I love that. So thank you for the question. So one of the things that I teach in training or concepts practice is restorative practice, which is originally a tribal First Nation practice. So I think being culturally responsive and teaching things that align with the cultures of the children and the young people, higher ed, that you're working with. But again, I would say start with training. One of the things that Global Minded offers and as a partner is lifebound coaching training. And I think that's specifically offered to higher ed partners. I think Global Minded works with like 15 colleges or less. Yeah? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Yeah, I saw the little red line. And so I think contacting Global Minded and asking for some lifebound coaching for the higher ed. And I work with that team as well. And if your college team wants to go through training on how to be a trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive coach, we can definitely make that happen for you.
Thank you. Yes, we'd be happy to hear from anyone. I'll put my contact information in the chat as well.
Was there another question, or Greg, do we have time for one more?
I don't know. It's up to you guys. We're at the top of the hour, so however you want to proceed.
Did we have one burning one, or we want to just wrap it up? We're good? Okay. So I want to say before we wrap it up, thank you all for caring enough about this topic to be present. This was only a surface level, really, conversation. So hopefully you all go and pursue additional training so that you can be equipped for COVID and beyond. Thank you.
And I'll just ask, I'll just add in.
2020. Thank you. Sorry, Greg, go ahead.
No, I'm just going to thank you guys for the opportunity and let you close it out, Celeste. Thank you.
Well, we certainly are glad to have everyone participate today in this very relevant topic. And thank you for all your insight, Plashan. We really appreciate that. And we look forward, we'll have this posted on YouTube today, the end of today. And we welcome you to more programs we have next week.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.